Thank you, and good evening again. My name is Ed Stork. I'm president-elect of the Laguna Beach Historical Society. And I want to welcome you all here tonight. We're glad you're all here, and we have an outstanding program for you. And I hope you also signed in at the back table when you came in. And if you'd like to, we'd sure welcome your membership back at that table if you're not a member yet, or if you'd like to leave a contribution, that would be great. Ours is a nonprofit that runs entirely on memberships and contributions. And we appreciate your participation in that way, as well as showing up for our general meeting tonight. Our next general meeting will be held on, get up here, I gotta look at it here. Should put my glasses on. November 16th will be our next general meeting, and it's gonna be at the Presbyterian Church, right around here over at Tankersley Hall. And they're having their 100th anniversary celebration, and we're joining in with that. So we'd welcome you then as well on November the 16th. We are privileged tonight to have one of our own, well, before I do that, I should say, well, some of our board members are here. Will you stand up or raise your hand or something? Yeah, some of our board members are around. And we're privileged tonight to have our featured speaker to be one of our board members and our resident historian. Glenna Matthews is a student of history. She has a PhD in American history from Stanford University. She's spent a lot of her life in Laguna Beach, and she was on tenure at Oklahoma State, but she gave that up to come back to California quite a few years ago. She has been a visiting associate professor at University of California at Berkeley, Stanford, UCLA, and University of California, Irvine. And she has published 6 books and 20 scholarly articles, many on California history. And she will talk tonight on the Laguna Playhouse, a treasured community institution. Please help me to welcome Glenna Matthews, our historian.
And Arnold is absolutely right. I'm a Giants fan, and Arnold and I are always exchanging very important information about our beloved Giants. I want to begin by acknowledging, well, first of all, I want to say that this whole enterprise has been a labor of love because the Playhouse meant so much to me when I was growing up. I want to acknowledge the help of board member Nelda Stone, of Debbie Paul Kermode, Jenny Williamson Riker, Jane Jantz, a board member and fount of knowledge about Laguna, Johanna Ellis, who is the resident tech expert, and Carolyn Hobart Fish, who lent me a number of images. And I also, thanks to Nelda, I found out about a Long Beach State MA thesis that was done in 1963 about the history of the Laguna Playhouse. So it was very useful to have my own memories and a scholarly work. I want to begin with a quote from Ed Hobart. Yay, Carolyn. She lent me a CD of a conversation between her dad and Dave Monahan. And her dad said, "The Playhouse was the center of the community." And that's how it seemed when my family moved here in 1946. I was 7 years old. I had seen one play in my life before we got here. I had a couple of hilarious introductions to the theater. The first play I saw was in Sacramento, and it was Charlie's Aunt, which is very, very funny. And then the second play I saw was here in Laguna, You Can't Take It With You, in 1946. And I just can't tell you how magical I found going to that Laguna Playhouse. It was absolutely wonderful. So let me begin with a few images. This is the Playhouse in the classic era. How many of you remember that building? I have a personal memory. In the summer of 1953, I was an apprentice in summer stock, and I spent a lot of my summer scraping scenery, the flats. every week they would be reused and repainted. And so we would spend the first part of the week scraping flats so the scenery could be reused on that lawn. And here's another picture of the Playhouse. The first meeting, founding meeting of what would become the Community Playhouse was in October of 1920. And it was at that point a blending of the Playhouse and the Community Club. And names from that early period include some very well-known Laguna names: Elmer Jarris of the Lumberyard, Joe Thurston, I think we've heard of him, Roy Peacock, Frank Kuprian, the artist, and Isaac Frazee, who was the first visual artist to come to Laguna, I believe, in the late 19th century. The property on Ocean Avenue was soon acquired, and the first production was in 1922. The building was completed in 1924, and we have a wonderful image. That's, well, where Zinc is now is kind of across the street from that. As you see, Ocean Avenue was unpaved, and you can see the Presbyterian Church in the background. That same year, 1924, that the building was completed, the Community Players and the Community Club became two distinct organizations. Two more names that I encountered in this wonderfully helpful master's thesis were those of George Harrell, photographer of the stars and part-time resident of Laguna, and Marie Thurston, for whom our middle school is named. And then a name that I saw beginning in the late 1920s was Mrs. Guy Bates Post. Do any of you know who she was? She had had some theatrical career as Adele Ritchie. She was quite well known. She married, but it wasn't, I think, much of a marriage, came to Laguna and began directing plays, but it didn't take long for her to, she was a difficult person, I think we can fairly say. So there were conflicts between her and the other members of the staff. In 1930, I believe it was, there was a murder-suicide where she murdered her apparent lesbian lover and then committed suicide herself. And that was probably the most sensational crime, maybe in the whole history of Laguna, but certainly for its period. Well, this takes us to 1930, and the Great Depression, not surprisingly, this was a very difficult period. The finances of the Playhouse had always been a bit shaky. There was a reliance on making money on productions, but that didn't always work. And so in 1937, the city took over ownership of the Playhouse in lieu of back taxes, and then leased it back to the Playhouse. But even with that, even with all the difficulties, during that period between 1930 and the beginning of World War II, they put on 97 productions. So, I mean, these people were pretty, I think we can say, undaunted. Carolyn lent me a clipping of a play they did in 1932, The Adding Machine. And the reason I wanted to mention that, her dad, Ed Hobart, was in it, but so was a man named Dilwyn Parish. Do any of you know who Dilwyn Parish was? He was, in his day, quite a well-known writer. He was, at the time, married to Gigi Parish, and we'll talk more about her in a little bit, but he and Gigi broke up, and his wife after Gigi was MFK Fisher, the famous food writer, and they met in Laguna. So Dilwyn Parish was in the play, so was Gigi. So again, these are very well-known Laguna names, and thank you, Carolyn, for the clipping. Another name that I found showing up in this decade was that of Marjorie Williamson. How many of you remember the Williamson family? Yeah. Marjorie came to Laguna from the Pasadena Playhouse. She had been the workshop director. She was extremely professional. She really knew what she was doing. And she started directing in 1936. And then another name that I found who showed up in the 30s was that of Betty Shope, who would become Betsy Paul, and I'm going to have a lot more to say about both the Williamsons and the Pauls. In listening to Carolyn, the CD she lent me of the conversation, Dave Monahan and Ed Hobart were talking about so many movies were made, and one of the movies that was made in Laguna in the 30s was Captain Blood. Certain scenes from Captain Blood with Errol Flynn were shot in Laguna in the 30s. And the director of Captain Blood was Michael Curtiz, who's a very famous director, you know, very distinguished filmography. And so both Ed and Dave were, I don't know, they were extras, they were, I think, stand-ins and so on. And the reason I'm bringing this up is that another thing that they started doing in the late 30s was they sponsored summer stock. And so there was the amateur community playhouse during the most of the year, and then in the summer it was professional theater. And people like Michael Curtiz would come and scout the talent. So that began in 1937, and certainly all through my growing up years, there was summer stock in the summer, and it was equity as opposed to the amateurs who were holding forth usually. Where did they get the money, Arnold? They charged more money, I guess, for the plays, but it was a going concern. And just to give you one instance of some of the people who were here, I'm going to show you a picture and a little bit of Ed and Keenan Wynn. But my mother used to usher at some of these plays when we got here. And my mother was, after, you know, she sat down to watch the play, and she recognized Ed Wynn, who was a very famous Hollywood comedian, and she asked this good-looking young man sitting next to her if he would pass the program to get Ed Wynn's signature. And she later found out that she had asked Peter Lawford to pass the program. So those are the kinds of people who are showing up for summer stock. In January of '42, the USO took over, and they used the Playhouse building for the duration of the war. And Carolyn lent me a picture that I think must be from, well, this is another picture of the Playhouse in action. I think this is the interior. This is from a later period, but it shows you the inside of the Playhouse. And then this is, I think, from the USO period. You see John Garfield and Lana Turner with the soldier. So the community players were reorganized in March of 1946 with $2.56 in the treasury. With this unpromising start, there proceeded to be a highly successful operation. They were soon able to hire professional directors, Marjorie Williamson being a professional director. So they paid the directors, but not the actors. using both proceeds from productions and the proceeds from the annual rental to summer stock. They also staged some intense membership drives. Hello, membership drives. Anybody heard that? And successfully. As it happens, the first play they did after the reorganization is the first play I saw as a child, and that's You Can't Take It With You. And when I found that in the master's thesis, I thought, oh, serendipity, I was there. And it was funny. It was just beautifully performed. I mean, I was a kid. What did I know? But looking back, those performances were just absolutely wonderful. On the left is not a really well-known movie star, but that's Ruth Hussey, who was a movie star in Hollywood. And she was in summer stock, I think in 46 or 47. And then here's a picture of Ed Wynn and Keenan Wynn. And I don't know who the little boy is, but as it happens, I had lunch with one of my high school classmates who lives in San Diego this past Saturday, and I told him about this talk, and I said, did you ever go to see plays? And he said, my folks took me to see one play. It was 20th Century with Keenan Wynn, and there was bad language in it. My mother would never take me to another play. He said, and he said, I recently saw 20th Century, and it's so mild, by today's standards, but once was enough for his mom. That was it. And then here's something from, I think it was summer stock from those years. On the right is an character actor who was in a zillion things in those years, Fred Clark. Does anyone remember his?
Armis Brooks, I think.
Oh, he was in a ton of things. But Michael Curtiz discovered him in summer stock in Laguna, and that led to his career.
Glenna, it's Michael Curtiz.
Curtiz.
That's how you pronounce it. Excuse me, I have a master's in film history.
Please.
And I've seen lots of Michael Curtiz movies. So that's how you pronounce his name.
My apologies. It's Michael Curtiz from now on. Anyhow, Michael Curtiz, because he'd come to Laguna, he'd filmed in Laguna, he came to summer stock, and he discovered this guy, and that led to Fred Clark's subsequent career. Well, I now want to talk about some of the wonderful performers. In particular, I've mentioned Betsy Paul, Betsy Shope at first, and the Williamson family. Those two families were in so many productions, members of those two families. Let me begin with Betsy and David Paul. And I have, I have a few more pictures of plays before I get to Betsy and David Paul. That's Betsy on the couch. Dee Dee, do you recognize Betsy?
Of course. Well, I didn't know her at that age, but.
This is a cover for Command Decision by William Worcester Haynes, and he was a very well-known writer at the time, and he lived in Laguna. This is a cover for the program of Stalag 17, which was, I think, about 1953. I worked backstage on Stalag 17. I was a little kid in high school. I was about 14, and somehow or other they trusted me to do the sound. The play has a very dramatic moment where somebody gets shot off stage with machine gun fire. I was the machine gun fire. I dropped a needle on an LP for the sound effects. You had to get your cue. remains to be seen. I wanted to show this because the actor here is Paul Smith. How many of you remember Paul Smith? Yeah, his full name was Arthur Paul Smith, and he was Art Smith locally, but when he started having a professional career in Hollywood, there was another Art Smith, so then he became Paul Smith. And he was in a lot of, he was another character actor. He was in a lot of shows. I think he might have been in the Doris Day Show or something like that. Anyhow, he had a long career as a character actor. And then this wonderful group picture. On the left is Paul Smith. On the right is David Paul, about whom we're going to be speaking. The older woman in the pale dress in the middle is Marjorie Williamson. In the dark dress, third from the left, is Mom Rankin. Between Paul Smith and Mom Rankin is Sonny Budd. And so there were just a lot of wonderful Laguna names in this picture, and it was apparently an awards program. So Debbie Paul Kermode, Betsy and David Paul's daughter, lent me some wonderful pictures. This is her mom, Betsy Paul, Betsy Shope Paul, as the tragic muse in the pageant. Isn't that gorgeous? So I want to talk about the Pauls first. David Paul came from a wealthy family in the East with 7 kids. The family also adopted Gigi, and then when the family went to France, they went to France for 2 years because they had the money to do something like that with 7 kids and an adopted daughter. They took Dilwyn Parish along as the tutor. He was this writer around town. And while they were abroad, Dilwyn and the 15-year-old Gigi fell in love. And they came back to the U.S., and at some point, I'm not sure just whether they got married abroad or when they got here, and this would have been in the late 20s or 1930s, something like that. They set off for California in a motorcycle. And they made it as far as the Southwest, and they had an accident. And so then I think Gigi was injured, but not seriously. And she had to recover in the hospital for a while, and then they made the rest of the trip by train. And that's what brought David Paul here. He did college in Pennsylvania, a brief stint trying to make it as an actor in New York City, served in the Navy, and then came back to Laguna, where he worked in the city, as well as being in plays. He and Betsy dated briefly, had brief marriages to others, and then married in 1947. Betsy was an only child who had come to California with her parents, attended Stanford, and began to be cast in radio soaps in the late 30s, as well as in appearing in plays here. And Debbie, her daughter, told me that she belonged to Equity, and that always created tension over her acting for free here. And so, you know, it was a little dicey how that was all going to play out. Here's Betsy in Joan of Arc. And when I was committed to doing this, I went up to Sebastopol to meet Betsy and see what kind of pictures that she had. And I walked in and I saw this picture of her mom as St. Joan, and it was like, I was there, I saw that play, I recognized the costume. And this is from 70 years ago. But that's how memorable it was to me as a child, how much I loved all of this. And this is her dad, this is David Paul. And this is an absolute treasure of a picture. This is I remember Mama. And there's Betsy, who played Mama. There's Debbie, who played the youngest child. There's Joe Thurston. There's Lynn Reynolds Carlin. How many of you know who Lynn Reynolds Carlin? Well, Lynn Reynolds was a year behind me in high school, and she went on to have a significant Hollywood career. She was in some John Cassavetes pictures, and in the 70s, she was actually nominated for an Academy Award as Best Supporting Actress for her role in Faces. So this is, you know, at the dawn of her career. And then on the right is Hap Graham, and he was another professional director, and he and Marjorie kind of split the directing duties at the Playhouse. And this is, I just love this picture. It's from a newspaper, but this is David and Betsy in 1983 in the gin game. And I mean, talk about documenting the length of their tenure in office and plays in Laguna Beach. She first starts performing in Laguna in the late 30s, and she's performing in the 1980s. And this is another wonderful picture of them as older people. And we have somebody here with us, Dee Dee, whom I had not met until tonight, but you knew the Paul household very well, as I understand.
The Pauls adopted me in 1964, and I finished my high school, the junior and senior year with Betsy and David. Debbie and I have had a 53-year friendship, so it's a delight to be here and be part of this presentation. And Betsy and David introduced me, and I did do some plays. One with Betsy. I did the Chalk Garden with Marcella Randall, and Long Day's Journey, and was it Long? Yes, Long Day's Journey.
Wow. Okay, now we're moving on to the other power couple, and this is Joe and Don Williamson. And their daughter, I didn't meet in person, but I talked to at some length over the telephone. And she said that they were cast as Romeo and Juliet. This is obviously in the pageant. And that's how they met. And this is a painting of, you know, the balcony scene from Romeo and Juliet. And they seem to be acting it very convincingly. So she told me, their daughter Jenny told me, that Marjorie, of course, we've already heard about. She came in 1936. She had this career in Pasadena, but before she got to Pasadena, Don was born in Mexico City. The father was there to run the YMCA in Mexico City, and so he lived most of his early life in Mexico City and didn't come to the U.S. until college in Wisconsin. And then he trained as an architect at USC. And what I don't know for certain that Marjorie was directing the pageant, but she may well have at some point. But the daughter told me that she met Joe, who was then working at the Bank of America downtown. And the daughter told me that her mom had been Miss Laguna in the 1930s. And so Grandma cast Mom as Juliet and then called her son and said, "You've got to meet Juliet, you can be Romeo." And, you know, that's just a family story. I couldn't verify that in the records, but it's a good story, so I had to share it with you. And so let me show you some more pictures of the Williamsons. So there's the family about 1969. The son Doug on the left, and then Joe, Marjorie, Don, and Jenny on the right, and that's Jenny's son. And of course, in addition to being a practicing architect in Laguna, Don directed the pageant for a good many years. There's Marjorie. And there's Don. And this I wanted to, I don't know how much of it you can read, but I'm going to tell you who all is in this play. Detective story, and it was performed, I think, in the fall of '53 or maybe even earlier than that. It's directed by Marjorie Williamson. The lead is played by Don Williamson. He's Detective James McLeod. Mrs. McLeod is Joe Williamson. David Paul is a cat burglar. Russ Potter, how many of you remember Russ Potter? He was the voice of the pageant for a while. He was in it. And Ray Eubank was in it. And Ray Eubank. I remember Detective Story very well. I was there. I mean, we really didn't miss plays. Because at the end, the good guy, played by Don Williamson, got shot by a perp. And when he got shot, I burst into loud sobs. I've never been known for controlling my emotions. And my mother was sitting up in the balcony having ushered, and she comes running downstairs when the play ended, and she said, "Glenna, I knew when I heard someone sobbing it had to be you." And she was right. It was me. So now I'm going to tell you about my illustrious career. This is a play I was in 1951. It was The Clown Who Ran Away. The clown, Ray Eubank was the clown, is on the left, and I'm next to him. I was Glorious Gloria, the flirting doll. And let's see, with the vest, the dark vest, that's Anita Lewis. Some of you may remember her. Her mom, Matilda, was the principal of the elementary school. And so I just want to share with you, here's the playbill, a little bit shop worn since it's been around for a good many years. But Dodo, a circus clown, as Ray Eubank. Actually, Jenny Jo Williamson was the lady with the baby carriage. That's Don and Joe's daughter. And this is Vera Newcomb. How many of you remember Vera Newcomb? I wanted to show pictures of Vera Newcomb. I mean, when I was growing up, in addition to seeing these wonderful plays, there would be potlucks, and I can't remember, and I couldn't find in the records how often the potlucks were held. Were they monthly? Were they semi-annually? I can't remember. But I just remember long tables, and for once, I have an encyclopedic memory for food. But for once, I don't remember the food. What I remember was that Vera Newcomb was the entertainment. And the only thing I can say about it is my family moved away when I graduated from high school, and it took me 49 years to get back. But I, by God, made it back because I wanted to live in a town where somebody like Vera Newcomb entertained. I mean, it was wild. This woman did I didn't even know at the time what it was, but I've since seen English music hall numbers. And I think that's what she was doing. And she would, you see the gray pompadour, she would strut up and down wearing these extravagant clothes like this and sing and vamp the audience with her pompadour. And, you know, I grew up thinking that, oh, all small towns are like this. And then when we moved away, I found out that that wasn't the case. And I mean, it's not like Laguna is perfect. I don't want to gild the lily. But it was so thrilling to have a lot of really interesting people in town and in a small town. And bland suburbia just didn't cut it after that. And here's another picture of Vera Newcomb. So it was the summer of 1953 when I was an apprentice in the summer theater. And I told you that my main job was scraping flats. We didn't have any really A-list celebrities who were in the plays, but the person that I remember the most vividly, how many of you know the name Huntington Hartford? I mean, there's a Huntington Hartford Theater, I think, in Pasadena. He was the A&P heir, and his then wife, and I've Googled, and he had many wives, but his then wife was in the plays. Her name was Marjorie Steele. And I just remember I was like 14, and I was always trying to think of some reason that I could approach the great A&P heir and come up with some reason why he needed to sponsor me, but I never thought of anything. And here this was the one performance that they cast me in. I'm on the left, I'm Clara the maid. And that's Betsy Paul on the right. And I will tell you something that I've told friends, but I've never told this story publicly. I was 14. I did not really belong in a very responsible position. It was a murder mystery. I carried in a tray that held the poison that was where the, murder was administered. I was standing off stage, and in my nerves, I was rattling the tray, shaking it. Whew. The cups and saucers and everything bounced onto the stage. And I mean, at least I had the good sense to know you don't break character. So I went out and in character, I apologized. I said, "Oh, sir, I'm so sorry." And everybody was cleaning up. And afterwards, it turns out that people thought that it was a little bit of comic relief in a dark play. But it was really my clumsiness. But it didn't ruin the performance, and that was no thanks to me. And that's the playbill it was called The Gioconda Smile by Aldous Huxley. The director was Demetrius Vallon, and I was scared to death of him. And there's the playbill, and you can see I'm Clara, Glenna Ingalls. It was a repertory 1 week, and then that's why we were scraping flats. I mean, they must have had 2 sets of flats, and one of them would be up and running, and we'd be during the daytime getting them ready for the next week. And yeah, it was an interesting experience for a 14-year-old kid to be around all these seasoned theater people. My parents had no idea what they were allowing me to be exposed to, but that's another story. Well, that's my presentation. I'm ending as of 1960 because that's when my memories end. We moved away in 1955, and that's when the master's thesis ends. So the whole era of morphing into Laguna Molten Playhouse is certainly worthy of research and study, but it's somebody else's project. And I'm happy to entertain questions.
Glenna,
We have a microphone. Sorry, let's turn mine on. We have a microphone. We're recording this presentation, so if you have a question or comment, just raise your hand and we'll get a microphone to you.
One question. You forgot about Roy Ropp, who was on the board during the in the early days of the Playhouse. There's a hysterical photograph of him and his wife in these floppy hats like they're artists, and it's really hysterical. It's very funny. Anyway, and on the children's plays, were they on a regular basis? Do you know?
Pardon me?
The children's plays, were they during the year, or were they during the summer? Or?
No, they were during the year. They were usually Christmas plays.
Christmas plays. Oh, okay.
I was in another one called La Noche Buena. And I have a story about that, too. Paul Smith was in it with me, and Russ Potter. But I won't mention any names, but there was an older woman, and the play opens. I had the lead. I was, I think, Maria, and I was praying over a creche, and I was saying, please, baby Jesus, send my lover Juan back to me. And this older woman was known to tipple, and she missed her cue. I'm all alone on the stage, and I'm saying, please, baby Jesus, please, baby Jesus. And she finally stumbled on stage. A children's play, very...
Well, Glenn, I think you might like to know that our current executive director and artistic director and development director from the Laguna Playhouse are here tonight, right here.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah, right back here. So, oh, and Wally, he's our lobby Nazi. He's right here too. So, yeah. Yeah, so this is really, really nice to have everybody here to enjoy this tonight.
Well, I'm so glad to establish this link of continuity. It's a wonderful tradition in this town.
We also have a Moulton.
Oh, yes, of course, yeah.
Betty, you want to say anything to her or add to her?
Jared Moulton.
Oh, well, so Nellie Gail Moulton, who was a big supporter of the Playhouse and the era that you kind of led up to, was my great-grandmother. And so we're piecing together that history ourselves in preparation for the centennial celebration for the
Right.
Playhouse. So we hope to tap some of your memories over the next couple years, maybe sooner, as we get ready for that celebration and telling the entire story. Yes. Yeah, an early president of the Art Association, and
We're celebrating our 100th starting in January.
Oh,
great.
yeah. I should say, apropos of Roy Ropp, I don't think that his name was in that master's thesis, and for the earlier period, when I didn't have personal memories, if it wasn't in the master's thesis, it wasn't going to, you know.
Well, I just came across the photograph.
Well, that's wonderful. I mean, it's a friendly amendment, but that, I mean, it wasn't a deliberate omission on my part.
I
Very
must say that in when I first came here, I did a lot of research on whatever I could find, and Andy Barnacle was generous with his files, having been the artistic director for 20 years, and so I did a lot of reading about the history of the Playhouse, and it's been fun over the last few years as we march towards our 100th anniversary to really revisit. I've kind of approached it decade by decade from the beginning of the Playhouse, and it's fun to kind of see what the body of work was per decade, and you really it's really just a microcosm of sociologically what what the times were like, what times in Laguna were like, and certainly that whole wartime period where the Playhouse served such a enormous role in the war effort and in the USO. But it's been fun to kind of really imagine what some of those great productions were, and I welcome any information anyone has as we look to programming those seasons around our 100th and what we might resurrect from earlier eras that really, certainly, I hear a lot about You Can't Take It With You, a lot about Detective Story. There are certain productions in each decade that really stood out for people, and it's been a pleasure to kind of look back on some of those and see what might resonate for people now as we try to resurrect things that represent the last 100 years. You can't do it all, but
Well, I certainly hope that you can focus on some of those two couples that I focused on, because
Yeah.
they were so instrumental, and both of them, the daughters, have memories, they're reachable. Unfortunately, the photos, I mean, it's a miracle that we have the photos we do, because both families had catastrophic fires.
right.
And in
And
fact,
has Pauline Walpin been involved in the Historical Society all in Laguna Beach? Pauline Walpin, does anybody know her? She was a real font of information for me when I came here. Her husband was the master carpenter at the Mark Taper Forum for almost 40 years, but he raised his family, built a home here, and commuted to downtown LA from Laguna Beach to the Taper every day. And she had a lot of information about the early days of the Playhouse and spoke a lot about those couples too. So it's really valuable information for us to know as we look at our legacy and celebrate those 100 years. And it's a lot to try to encapsulate in a few seasons surrounding that celebratory time, but we'd really like to pay homage in some way to that, and we're all pretty dedicated to doing that, yeah.
well, speaking of paying homage, the Paul family gave a plaque for a bench right by that call board, and when the benches were taken down, the plaque was just given back to the family. So there was something commemorating Betsy and David, but when the city took the benches down, that went bye-bye.
They also have a drama scholarship every year.
I know, I gave it this year. The family asked me to give the scholarship to at the high school awards.
Other questions or comments? Jane?
Just one comment. My mother said that the firemen, talking about Vera Newcomb, that the local fireman's biggest fear in Laguna Beach was a fire in Vera Newcomb's hair.
I remember Vera so well when I was young, teenager. We'd see her on the street, we'd see her coming, and she just would start singing on Forest Avenue. She'd just sing walking down the street, and we just, oh my God, we were so embarrassed just because she was such a dramatic, you just would never forget her if you knew her, She was fantastic. In that hair, and then she was such a, what do I want to say? She just was so dramatic, and she would just start from nowhere, just singing. This vaudeville kind of, very eccentric, yes. And vaudeville, I mean, you sang a lot of vaudeville. So, yeah, I remember her well.
Oh, okay. So my name is Aditi Prince, and the Paul family adopted me when I was a junior in high school. And living with the Pauls, I mean, the entertainment that went on at their homes, David could recite poetry. There was singing and a gaiety there, and some of the after play parties that were held at the Pauls were just, it was just a fabulous experience. And the home that they had on Temple Hills at that time had this backdrop of the ocean. And, for a teenager who came from the valley, we were talking about living in the valley, and then came down to Laguna and ended up living with them. And the dramatic, Betsy had this beautiful hair and then this white streak that was very dramatic. But as a couple, people loved to come to their home to be entertained. It was fabulous.
I forgot to mention, when you were talking about them, Gigi and Dilwyn broke up, and Dilwyn married MFK Fisher, and Gigi married John Weld. And John didn't like the name of Gigi, so she became Katie Weld. And when we moved away, we moved to Laguna in the 40s, moved away, and then moved back in 1951. And my father worked for the Laguna Beach Post. He was the editor of the Laguna Beach Post, and John Weld was his boss. And so I remember John and Katie very well, but I had no idea. I mean, Katie was a Wampus baby star as Gigi Parish, and George Harrell photographed her very erotically, shall we say. Arnold.
And John Weld was a stuntman in Hollywood.
Yeah.
And then he became the Ford dealer in Laguna Beach.
Right.
He was the boss man, but he was the boss man with Bud Desenberg of the
Right. Well, John owned it first, and then he sold it to Bud. But I believe, Jane, is it accurate to say that we're working on getting a program about John and Katie / Gigi? We can't promise, but we're working on it. Because John Weld was a novelist, and, you know, they both had, well, just the whole idea that Gigi married at 15 and they set off on motorcycle. I mean, these are not dull people.
John Weld wrote a column for the Post for years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do we have anyone else that'd like to say? Well, in that case, I want to, that we all would show our appreciation to Glenna for this fine presentation.
One other announcement about the Playhouse. We have a new display at our bungalow up in our front bedroom. We've got 2 new cabinets, and 1 cabinet is designated for the Playhouse, and Glenna helped put that together. So if you want to know a little bit more and see some of these things up close, I think we have some.
If you would like to come and visit at the bungalow, it's open from 1 to 4 p.m. every Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And we encourage not only you coming to the bungalow, but participating in the Historical Society. If you haven't done so, we enjoy having you all here, and thank you for coming. I should say our next meeting again is November 16th at Tankersley Hall at the Presbyterian Church to help them celebrate their 100th anniversary. Thank you and good night.